Imagine a man standing at the center of a Roman amphitheater sometime in the 2nd century, surrounded by tens of thousands of spectators gathered not for entertainment alone, but for a demonstration. A demonstration that Rome used to send a message to every province, every city, every household that harbored people who refused, even under threat of death, to bow to the emperor and speak the words that all loyal citizens were expected to declare: Caesar is Lord. He is not trembling. That is the first thing you notice. He's not scanning the crowd for an exit, not rehearsing arguments in his mind. He has already had that conversation with his friends, with his community, with God. The decision was made long before this moment. What remains now is simply to walk through the door. The lions are released, the crowd reacts, and then it is over, faster than anyone expected. A few moments of chaos, a silence that falls heavier than the cheering that preceded it, and then nothing. No more arena, no more empire, no more voices telling him he was wrong to believe what he believed, wrong to refuse what every reasonable person around him accepted as harmless compromise. Gone, the empire, the crowd, the smell of sand and iron. Gone. What replaces it is not darkness, not void, not the long, dreamless sleep that those watching the arena assumed would be his fate. Something else entirely begins. The man opens his eyes, and what he sees is not what anyone watching him die would have expected. Around him are other people, people he recognizes from the stories he was told, those who had died before him in other arenas, other prisons, other moments of refusal. And they are not waiting, not sleeping, not in a holding pattern. They are standing. They are present. They have been given something that Rome spent centuries convincing the world was its exclusive property: authority. The Apostle John saw this. He wrote it down in Revelation chapter 20, verses 4 through 6. I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Thrones, plural, distributed authority. This is what the Bible calls the first resurrection. And this is where we begin today. If this kind of biblical revelation speaks to your spirit, subscribe to this channel before we go further. This is where the hidden things of God's Word are uncovered, and this is only the beginning of what we are about to open together. For most of church history, the concept of the millennial kingdom was treated as a secondary doctrine, debated by theologians, footnoted in seminary courses, occasionally referenced in end-time sermons, but never fully opened, never fully examined. What gets missed in that approach is something staggering. The millennial reign of Christ on earth is not a footnote. It is an entire era of human history, 1,000 years during which everything the prophets of Israel described as the ultimate destiny of this planet actually comes to pass. The wolf lies down with the lamb. The earth is full of the knowledge of the Lord. The righteous reign. The nations come to Jerusalem to worship. This is not poetry. This is the prophetic calendar of a God who announced the end from the beginning and delivers on every word. What exactly does Revelation chapter 20 describe? John sees an angel descend from heaven, holding a key to the abyss and a great chain. Satan, the dragon, the ancient serpent, is seized, bound, and thrown into the abyss for 1,000 years. During this period, those who were killed for their testimony of Jesus and their faithfulness to God's word, and those who refused to worship the beast or receive its mark, are raised from the dead and given thrones. They reign with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead do not rise until the 1,000 years are over. That distinction, the first resurrection, set apart from everything that comes after, is not a minor theological technicality. It is the central promise of the entire passage, and understanding what it means changes everything about how you understand the Christian life. Pay close attention to what the binding of Satan actually accomplishes, because most people misread this part. The Greek word translated bound is deo, chained, restrained, locked, and the abyssos, the abyss, is not a symbol. It is described elsewhere in Scripture as a sealed prison, a place of complete confinement, accessible only to God's authority. Satan is not weakened during the millennium, not operating at reduced capacity, not whispering at lower volume. He is removed completely from any access to the human world. For 1,000 years, every human being alive on earth will live without satanic deception, without spiritual manipulation, without the invisible pressure that has bent every civilization since the garden. That is the starting condition of the millennial kingdom, and that starting condition sets up the most important experiment in human history. Here is where most people stop reading carefully. The assumption is that the binding of Satan means the end of human rebellion, that once the great deceiver is removed, people will naturally choose righteousness, and peace will prevail because the corrupting influence is gone. The millennium appears to confirm this at first. For 1,000 years, peace prevails, the nations prosper, the earth is restored. But the text is not telling you that the binding of Satan produces goodness in humanity. It is doing something more complex and more unsettling than that. The binding removes the primary external agent of spiritual deception. What remains, what the millennium spends 1,000 years revealing, is the question of what the human heart does when that external agent is absent. And the answer, which comes at the end of those 1,000 years, is the most disturbing verse in all of eschatology. Imagine what it would feel like. A world where the spiritual architecture of deception, the invisible whispers that feed on fear, the manipulation of desire, the lies that amplify your worst moments into compulsion, simply goes silent, not suppressed, gone. Every civilization in human history has operated under that pressure, even when they didn't know it. Every person you have ever known has made decisions, built habits, developed fears, cultivated blindness, at least in part, under that influence. Now imagine waking up on the first morning of a world where it does not exist. The air is different. Something inside you breathes differently. And yet, something in you also remains. Something that belongs entirely to you. The millennium has just begun, and God is watching what that something will do. If this is stirring something deep in your spirit right now, write in the comments, "Jesus is Lord." Drop it below. I want to see your faith declared. Every civilization in human history has attempted in its own way to build what the millennium delivers. Egypt constructed an empire on slave labor and called it divine order. Rome promised peace through absolute military dominance, the Pax Romana, which lasted roughly 200 years before collapsing under its own weight. Every ideology of the modern era, communism, democratic utopianism, technocratic governance, has promised that the right system, applied with sufficient intelligence and force, will finally produce the world humanity has always wanted. Every single one has failed. Not necessarily because the people running them were entirely evil, but because the fundamental flaw was never primarily in the system. The flaw was in the heart of the people building it. The millennium is different for one reason. It is not built by human hands, administered by a government capable of corruption, or sustained by the ambitions of anyone who can be bought. Isaiah chapter 65, written 7 centuries before Christ, describes the conditions of the millennial kingdom with a specificity that is almost difficult to read given the world we inhabit. Verse 20 says, "No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days, for the young man shall die 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be accursed." Read that carefully. A person who dies at 100 years of age will be considered young, Infant mortality, one of the defining sorrows of the human story across every era of recorded history, across every civilization and geography and level of development, disappears entirely. The life expectancy of the millennial world is not measured in decades. It is measured in centuries. Under the rule of Christ, the very relationship between the human body and time is transformed. Picture what daily life looks like under those conditions. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. That last line deserves to be held. The fundamental anxiety underneath almost every economic system humanity has ever developed, the fear that what you build will be taken from you, that your labor will be stripped away by violence, exploitation, or institutional failure, that anxiety simply does not exist in this world, not because law enforcement has improved, not because governments became more honest, because the king is just, because justice is not delayed, because the entire structure of the world has been reorganized around a ruler who cannot be bribed, deceived, or compromised in any form. The millennial world works because its government has no flaw at the center. Here is a detail in Isaiah 65 that raises a question most teachers skip over entirely. Verse 20 mentions death. It mentions a sinner dying at 100 years. If the millennium is populated by resurrected, glorified saints reigning with Christ, why does anyone die at all? The answer reveals something crucial about the structure of this kingdom that completely changes how you understand everything else we are about to cover. The millennium is not populated exclusively by those in glorified resurrection bodies. It is populated by two distinct groups: those in the first resurrection, the glorified saints who reign with Christ and cannot die, and the surviving mortal nations, the human population that came through the tribulation in physical bodies, still capable of sin, still capable of choosing. Two groups, one restored earth, two radically different experiences of the same kingdom. The glorified saints, those in the first resurrection, reign. They hold authority. They are the governing body of the millennial kingdom, administering the rule of Christ from Jerusalem to the nations of the earth. They do not age. They do not get sick. They cannot die. But the mortal nations, the people who survived the tribulation and entered the millennium in physical, unresurrected bodies, are still fully human. They can have children. They age slowly under the extended lifespans Isaiah describes. They build and plant and live, and they can still choose. Every generation born during the millennium faces the same fundamental decision that every human being in every era of history has faced. Who do they ultimately serve? The millennium removes every excuse except the most basic one, the heart itself. If this content is opening Scripture in a way you haven't seen before, hit that like button right now. It helps this revelation reach one more person who is searching for it today. Here is the word that changes everything about how the saint's role is described. In Revelation chapter 20, verse 4, the Greek text says the martyrs and the faithful basileuo, with Christ for 1,000 years. English Bibles translate this as reigned, but basileuo is not a passive verb. It is not the word for someone who attends a king's court, or serves in a king's household, or advises from a position of influence. Basileuo is the verb form of basileus, king. It means to exercise kingly authority, to govern, to rule as a sovereign. The people John sees seated on those thrones in Revelation 20 are not decorative. They are not ceremonial witnesses to Christ's reign. They are governors, administrators, rulers. The resurrected saints do not merely observe while Christ reigns. They reign with him, over the nations, over the affairs of an entire restored earth. In the year 155 AD, a man named Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, was brought before the proconsul of Asia. He was 86 years old. The proconsul offered him a way out. Renounce Christ, swear by Caesar, and you go free. Polycarp's response became one of the most quoted lines in all of early Christian history. 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? He was burned alive. The crowd tore his body with spears when the fire moved more slowly than expected. In the eyes of Rome, Polycarp lost everything: his freedom, his position, his life. He held no property, no title, no political standing. But here is what Revelation 20 tells us about men and women like Polycarp, Basileo. He is not waiting, he is not commemorated, he is reigning, and the throne is not metaphorical. The prophet Zechariah, writing 5 centuries before Christ, saw something in the millennial kingdom that fills in what Revelation 20 only sketches. Every year, the nations of the earth travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, the ancient harvest festival, the feast Israel celebrated after 40 years in the wilderness to commemorate the provision and presence of God. But in the millennium, this feast is not optional tradition maintained by devout communities. Every surviving nation on earth sends representatives to Jerusalem to worship the King. This is governance organized around worship. The administrative calendar of the entire earth is structured around the presence of God in the city where Christ reigns. The nations come not as tourists, not as observers, but as subjects paying tribute to the one whose authority over them is not claimed. It is simply real. But Zechariah records something in chapter 14 that disrupts any picture of seamless universal compliance. Not every nation comes. Some refuse. And God's response is specific. No rain, drought, plague. The withholding of the agricultural abundance that Isaiah 65 describes as one of the defining features of millennial life. Why does this matter? Because it tells you that even in the millennium, even with Christ physically present as King in Jerusalem, even with 1,000 years of visible divine justice, even with resurrected saints governing every region of the earth, the nations still retain the option to refuse. The millennium does not override free will. It surrounds free will with the most optimal possible conditions in history. It removes deception. It provides perfect governance. And then it watches what the human heart does with that. This is one of the most important theological facts about the millennial kingdom that almost never gets preached. The millennium is not a world where everyone automatically chooses God because God is so obviously present. It is a world where everyone chooses God or does not, with full information, under optimal conditions, with zero satanic interference, under perfect governance, with the consequences of choices immediately visible and undeniable. This is precisely what makes what happens at the end of the 1,000 years so devastatingly significant. What follows is not merely a final battle, it is a verdict. God completing the longest demonstration in human history, one that began in the garden, ran through every civilization and covenant and era, and arrives here at its conclusion, and the conclusion will shatter every comfortable assumption about human nature that you have ever held. Somewhere in the 7th century of the millennium, a family is gathered at their table. They have never known war. They have never seen an infant die. Their grandparents, who survived the tribulation, told them stories. The chaos, the darkness, the years when the nations rose against each other and the world seemed to be coming apart at its foundation. For this family, that is ancient history. All they have ever known is this: a world that works, a government that is just, a king whose face their ancestors claim to have seen in Jerusalem. They believe it, most of them do. But in one of their children, something stirs. A restlessness, an irritation at the boundaries, a quiet question that grows louder every year. Is the king really necessary? Could we not manage this ourselves? The question has no satanic author. Satan is locked away. The question belongs entirely to the heart. If you have been carrying a sense that what you have been taught about the end of all things is only a fraction of what Scripture actually reveals, that something deeper is waiting just beyond the surface of what most churches teach, I left something for you in the first pinned comment below. It is for those who are ready to go further. 1,000 years pass. The earth has been governed well. The nations have been administered justly. The first fruits of humanity, those who died for the name of Jesus, have reigned as kings, exactly as promised. And then Revelation chapter 20, verse 7, delivers the most disorienting sentence in all of biblical prophecy. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations. Why? What is the purpose of releasing a defeated enemy who has been confined for 10 centuries? Why, after everything, after all the visible proof, all the demonstrable glory, all the undeniable evidence of God's faithfulness? Why does God open that door again? That question deserves a real answer, and the answer reshapes everything. It is not a mistake, not a loophole that God failed to anticipate, not the result of some celestial technicality in the terms of Satan's imprisonment. Every detail of Revelation is intentional. Every image is precise. The 1,000 years are a set number, not an approximation. The release is as deliberate as the binding. God has not lost control of the sequence. This is the sequence. And the release of Satan at the end of the millennium is not a plot twist. It is the conclusion of an argument God has been building across the entire arc of human history. An argument about the human heart, about what it does and what it needs, about what no environment, however perfect, can produce in a heart that has not been genuinely transformed from the inside. The binding of Satan accomplished something extraordinary. For 1,000 years, every human choice was made without satanic deception, without spiritual manipulation of fear and desire, without the invisible architecture of lies that has shaped every civilization, every culture, every family since the fall. The millennium showed the world what humanity looks like without that pressure. And the verdict across those 1,000 years was not entirely bleak. The nations largely flourished, the systems worked, the earth was healed. But the key word is largely. Because the release of Satan is designed to reveal what 1,000 years of optimal conditions could not eliminate. The remnant of unregenerate desire that was simply waiting, in the absence of deception, for the deception to return and confirm what it already knew it wanted. There is a belief, widespread, intuitive, deeply human, that if you simply remove bad influences, people will naturally gravitate toward good. Take away the corrupt systems, the manipulative voices, the spiritual darkness, and what remains is the authentic self, which, left to its own devices, will choose love and truth. This belief shaped centuries of philosophy. Rousseau built an entire worldview on it. Enlightenment humanism rests its foundation on a version of it. And the millennial kingdom is the definitive cosmic scale test of whether this belief is true. God gives humanity 1,000 years under the best possible conditions, optimal governance, no deception, visible truth, and then watches what happens when the possibility of deception returns. The results are recorded in Revelation chapter 20, and they do not support the optimism. Satan steps out of his confinement. He does not immediately rebuild an empire from scratch or slowly reconstruct systems of influence over generations. He goes out to deceive the nations, and the nations respond, not after years of manipulation, not after centuries of spiritual erosion, almost immediately. From the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog gather in numbers so vast that Revelation 20 verse 8 compares them to the sand of the sea. They march toward Jerusalem. They surround the city of the King, And this moment is not evidence of Satan's power. It is evidence of something that was always already present, something that 1,000 years of perfect government, perfect justice, and supernatural provision could not uproot, something that belongs entirely to the unregenerate human heart, without outside assistance. Something in the unregenerate heart was not waiting to be deceived. It was waiting for permission. The restlessness stirring in that millennium-born child at the family table, the quiet question growing louder over the years, the irritation at the boundary, the sense that the king's authority is an imposition rather than a gift, that was not placed there by Satan. Satan was locked away. That was the heart, exposed, unmanipulated, genuinely itself. Satan's release did not create the rebellion. Satan's release gave the rebellion a name and a direction. He activated what was already present, and this distinction, precise, specific, theological, is the key that unlocks everything else about what the millennium is demonstrating to the watching universe. Revelation 20 verse 8 says, "Their number is like the sand of the sea." After 1,000 years of witnessing the millennial kingdom of Jesus Christ, the visible reign of the one who died for them, the daily reality of a just government, the evidence of supernatural provision all around them, the extended lifespans of Isaiah 65, the peace of Isaiah 11, there are still so many humans who choose rebellion at the first opportunity that the Bible describes their number as uncountable. That is not a minor theological footnote. That is a statement about the human condition at its core, a statement that no utopia can resolve, no system can fix, no environment, however optimal, can transform. The human heart, without genuine inner transformation, is bent away from God regardless of what it is shown. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 5th century, wrestled deeply with the nature of the human will after the fall. His doctrine of original sin was not primarily about the catalogue of human crimes. It was about the fundamental misalignment between the human will and the will of God that entered the human story at the garden. John Calvin, 1,000 years later, articulated what became known as total depravity, and consistently misunderstood. Total depravity does not mean that every human being is as evil as they could possibly be. It means that every faculty of the human person, intellect, will, emotions, desires, is affected, bent, oriented away from God in its natural state, not broken beyond repair, bent, and the millennium proves this with a 1,000-year experiment. Optimal conditions cannot unbend a will that has not been internally renewed by the one who made it. Why would God design the sequence to include this final rebellion? Why build 1,000 years of peace only to allow its disruption at the end? Because the millennium is not simply a reward for the faithful. It is a demonstration. The last chapter of an argument God has been making through all of human history. An argument about what the human heart needs that external circumstances simply cannot provide. Eden was paradise. It was not enough. The law of Moses gave explicit divine instruction with clear consequences. It was not enough. The prophets spoke with unmistakable clarity across centuries. It was not enough. The Incarnation walked the earth and demonstrated the life of God in human form. It was not enough for everyone. The millennium gives humanity 1,000 years of perfect government, and it will not be enough, because the need was never primarily a better environment. The need was always a new heart. Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 33. Written 6 centuries before Christ and more relevant at the end of the millennium than at any other moment in history. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This is the new covenant, the covenant God announced through Jeremiah as the replacement for the covenant at Sinai, written on stone tablets that remained external to the person. The new covenant is written inside, not on stone, on the heart itself, the innermost will, the deepest seat of desire and orientation, transformed. This is what distinguishes those who reign in the millennium from those who, at its end, gather with the deceiver's army. Not circumstance, not knowledge, not the amount of divine evidence they were exposed to. Transformation at the core. Revelation 20 verse 9, fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. No drawn-out battle, no prolonged siege, no final negotiation. Fire. The army that surrounded Jerusalem is consumed with the effortless final authority of a God who has been patient for 1,000 years and whose demonstration is now complete. The speed of the judgment is almost more unsettling than the force of it. This is not God struggling to contain the rebellion. This is not a close outcome. This is the conclusion of an argument that was already won, the closing of a chapter that was already written, the end of the last test in a sequence that leaves no variable untested and no condition unexplored. Satan himself, the deceiver, the ancient serpent, the one who has been at the center of human spiritual warfare since the garden, is thrown into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet already are. Revelation 20 verse 10, tormented day and night forever and ever. This is not another imprisonment, not another period of binding. This is permanent, irreversible, final. And then the sequence moves to what may be the most sobering passage in all of Scripture. The great white throne. Every human being who has ever lived and is not part of the first resurrection stands before it, the dead, great and small. No exceptions, no delays, no one misplaced, overlooked or processed under incomplete information. The record is total. Books are opened, multiple books. Every word, every action, every hidden thing, recorded with a completeness that no human record-keeping system has ever approached. Every moment of cruelty that happened in secret and left no witness. Every act of kindness that went entirely unnoticed. Every decision made in darkness that shaped a life. Every person who died without any human acknowledgement of their suffering. Every child who was harmed and never saw justice in this life. Then another book is opened, the book of life, and each person is judged by what was written. This is not God approximating justice through incomplete records. This is absolute, total, comprehensive account, the foundation of a judgment so thorough and so complete that nothing issued from it can be called unjust by any honest reading of the evidence. The great white throne is not for those who participated in the first resurrection. They are already reigning. They are already with Christ. This judgment is the judgment of those who did not share in the first resurrection. Every human soul that passed through history without being written in the book of life, death and Hades, are thrown into the lake of fire. This is what Revelation 20 verse 14 calls the second death. And what transpires at this throne is not the expression of a God who is finally losing patience. It is the completion of every covenant God made with humanity, every era, every set of circumstances, every revealed truth, arriving at its final accounting. Nothing is unfair, nothing is overlooked. Every opportunity that was offered and declined is on record. Every grace that was available and refused is counted. Most people encounter the white throne judgment and feel one thing first, fear. That is understandable. But read it again, more carefully. What is actually happening at the white throne is the completion of justice, not the compromised, delayed, partial, often corrupted justice of human courts, but the kind of justice that every victim in every age of history cried out for and rarely received while they were alive. Every child harmed and never vindicated, every woman silenced and never heard, every community destroyed by someone powerful who walked away untouched, every truth suppressed because the truth-teller had no platform and the liar had every advantage, every injustice committed in the confidence that no one with authority was watching. All of it answered. Finally, at a throne that never misses anything. From the very beginning, God gave humanity every possible circumstance in which to demonstrate what the heart would choose. In Eden, the conditions were paradise, and humanity chose. Under the law, the terms were explicit, the consequences clear, and generation after generation turned away. Through the prophets, the voice of God spoke across centuries of darkness with unmistakable clarity, and was rejected. In the Incarnation, God himself walked the earth, healed the sick, raised the dead, and taught with an authority no teacher had ever possessed, and was crucified. In the era of the Church, the Spirit was poured out, and the Scriptures spread across every language and culture on earth. And still, most turned away. In the tribulation, the consequences of rebellion became unavoidably visible. And still, the armies gathered. And then, in the millennium, 1,000 years. And still, if you let that sink in fully, not as doctrine but as the actual history of the relationship between God and the human race, it should shift something in the way you understand your own life. The unregenerate heart, the heart that remains unchanged despite optimal conditions, that chooses rebellion the moment rebellion becomes available, is not someone else's problem. It is the default condition of every human being born into this world. The thing that requires intervention, the thing that requires the new covenant, the thing that requires exactly what you have access to right now, in this moment, through the Spirit of God, who offers to write the law of God not on external stone, but on the interior of who you are. The millennium doesn't just show you the future, it shows you what you need right now, today, before any of it begins. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 24 through 26, describes the entire arc of Christ's reign. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, after destroying every rule and every authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Every enemy. Not the major ones, every one. The millennial kingdom is the period during which this happens systematically. Authority by authority, power by power, until the final enemy, death itself, is swallowed up in victory at the white throne. And this reign is not carried out by Christ alone. The saints, seated on thrones around him, share the assignment. This is not symbolic participation. This is basileo, governing authority, administered jointly until the full scope of the mandate is complete. Reigning until every enemy is under his feet. That is the throne's assignment. The scope is total, not partial victory. Every enemy, not most authorities subdued, every rule and power dismantled. The millennial kingdom is the visible, historical, 1,000-year execution of what the cross accomplished in the spiritual realm. What was accomplished in principle at Calvary is demonstrated in practice during the reign, enemy by enemy, nation by nation, death by death, until the day that Paul describes as the moment when the Son hands the completed kingdom back to the Father, and God becomes all in all. The saints on those thrones are not decorating the throne room, they are governing the process alongside the King who made them capable of doing so. Ezekiel, in chapters 40 through 48, provides an architectural blueprint for a temple that has never yet been built, a structure of remarkable scale and complexity, complete with detailed measurements, arrangements of courts and chambers, assignments for priests, and a river flowing from beneath its threshold that transforms the Dead Sea into fresh water. Centuries of interpreters treated this as a description of a post-exilic, rebuilt temple. But the measurements match no historical structure. The river into the Dead Sea has never happened. The geographical features described require a transformed landscape that does not yet exist. This is the millennial temple, the center of worship in the kingdom, where the nations come to honor the King, and where the glory of God dwells in the midst of the earth in a way that every previous temple only ever pointed toward from a distance. Isaiah chapter 11 fills in the natural world during the millennium with images that belong not to metaphor, but to a transformed ecology. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. The relationship between predator and prey, the food chain as we understand it, is restructured. The fear that governs the natural world is lifted. Even the animals live differently when the earth is governed by its rightful king. Creation, as Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, was subjected to futility in hope. And the millennium is the beginning of that hope made visible. Ignatius of Antioch was a bishop in the early 2nd century, a direct student of the Apostle John himself. He was arrested and transported to Rome to be executed in the arena. Along the way, he wrote a series of letters to the churches in cities he passed through, letters that have survived 2,000 years. In one of them, writing to the church in Rome, he asked them not to intervene on his behalf, not to attempt any rescue. He wrote, "I am the wheat of God, and am ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, that I may be found the pure bread of Christ." He was asking to be martyred, not because he was broken or despairing, but because he understood the economy of the kingdom. He understood that his death in Rome was not the end of his story. It was the transition point, the door that opened onto a throne. Polycarp stood before the fire. The proconsul had given him every opportunity. Swear by Caesar, renounce Christ, live. And Polycarp, standing between the crowd and the flames, 86 years old, the oldest living link to the original apostles, did not answer with defiance. He answered with a prayer. He lifted his eyes toward heaven and spoke, "O Lord God Almighty, Father of thy beloved and blessed Son, Jesus Christ, I thank thee that thou hast graciously thought me worthy of this day and of this hour, that I may receive a portion in the number of martyrs." He thanked God for the fire, for the moment of death, because he knew, with a certainty that the crowd watching could not comprehend, what came next. Not darkness, not the end. A throne. Basileo, the word he could not have translated but understood, in his bones. Verse 6 of Revelation 20 carries two words that sit side by side and deserve separate attention: blessed and holy. John uses both. Blessed speaks to favor, to the condition of receiving something wonderful, unearned, gracious, given from outside. But holy speaks to nature, character, being set apart in the deepest possible way. The first resurrection is not only a gift bestowed from outside, it is also the completion of a process that began at conversion, continued through every act of faithfulness, and is finalized at the resurrection itself. Those who share in it are not merely fortunate recipients of good timing. They have been transformed. The very substance of who they are has been brought into alignment with the holy character of God. Blessed, because it is given. Holy, because it is real. Both words together say, this is not just what happens to you, this is what you become. What is the second death, and why does it matter so much that those in the first resurrection cannot be touched by it? Revelation 20 verse 14 identifies it explicitly. The second death is the lake of fire, physical death, the death every human being faces at the end of biological life, is the first death. The second death is the final irreversible separation from God that is the consequence of the white throne judgment for those not written in the book of life. For those in the first resurrection, those who shared in the life of Christ, who were united with him in his death and resurrection and now reign with him, The second death has no jurisdiction, no claim, no access. They have passed through the only threshold that ultimately matters. The lake of fire is not their domain. It has no authority over the lives of those who were transformed. Somewhere in everything we have just covered, the martyrs on thrones, the binding of Satan, the Isaiah 65 world, the release and the final rebellion, the white throne, the second death, a question forms that is more important than all the others. You may have been feeling it build for the last few minutes. Most people, when they first encounter the millennium, ask about the timeline or the debate between premillennialism and amillennialism, or whether the 1,000 years is a literal number. Those are real questions, but they are not the most urgent question. The question that should be pressing against everything else right now, after everything we have walked through, is not academic. It is not theological in the distant sense. It is this: are you in the first resurrection? The most common version of that question gets asked backwards. People ask, do I have to live through the tribulation? Do I have to be physically martyred to qualify for a throne? And while those questions are understandable, they are focused on the wrong variable. The first resurrection is not reserved for those whose suffering reached a particular threshold of visibility or dramatic intensity. Revelation 20 verse 4 describes those on the thrones as people who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark. The defining characteristic is not the intensity of the persecution they endured. It is what they held and did not surrender under whatever form of pressure they faced. Faithfulness under pressure. Refusal to compromise when compromise was the easier path. That is the consistent thread running through everyone who receives a throne. The Greek word translated as testimony in Revelation 20 verse 4 is martyria. The English word martyr comes directly from this root, but in the early church, martyria described something broader than physical death. A martyr was someone who bore witness, who testified, who, when faced with a moment that demanded silence or compromise or denial, opened their mouth and spoke the truth regardless of the personal cost. The early church eventually distinguished between two kinds of witnesses: those who bore testimony with their blood, the red martyrs, and those who bore testimony throughout their entire lives without ever formally recanting, dying in old age, but never having exchanged the genuine for the convenient, the white martyrs. Both were honored. Both were counted as having given the testimony. The category was never limited to those who died in arenas. Someone watching this right now understands exactly what that means. Not as ancient church history, but as the present reality of their week. The compromise that keeps presenting itself as reasonable. The conversation that keeps getting avoided because the relationship makes it too costly. The slow, quiet erosion that does not happen in a single dramatic moment of denial, but across 1,000 small decisions where the testimony is softened, where the edge is sanded down, where the distinctiveness is gradually reduced, until what remains looks less like a life shaped by the kingdom and more like a life shaped by whatever the surrounding culture finds acceptable. The arena was one form of pressure. What you face daily is a different form of the same pressure. Different cost. Same testimony, different crowd, same choice. What ultimately separates those who reign with Christ in the millennium from those who at its end choose to march with Satan's army? It is not a difference in theological knowledge. The rebellious nations know exactly who Christ is. They lived under his rule for 1,000 years. It is not a difference in circumstances. Both groups experienced the same millennium. It is not even, ultimately, a difference in behavior, though behavior is the symptom. It is a difference in the fundamental orientation of the heart. One group was transformed from the inside. The law of God was written on their hearts through the new covenant, not as external obligation, but as internal desire. The other group carried all the external evidence of a good kingdom and was never changed by it, because internal transformation was never what they were actually seeking. Jeremiah 31 verse 33, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This covenant, signed in the blood of Christ, offered to every human being who receives it, is the only thing that distinguishes the redeemed who reign from the mortal nations who eventually rebel. Not because the redeemed are naturally better people, not because they accumulated fewer failures, but because something was written on the inside of them that restructured their fundamental desires, the hunger for God that the millennium's mortal nations can observe externally but never quite feel internally. That hunger was placed at the core of the redeemed by the Spirit of God. That is what the first resurrection confirms and completes. What the Spirit began at conversion, the resurrection finalizes. The trajectory that started with a new heart ends with a glorified one. The millennial kingdom, in the end, is not primarily about what the world will look like when Christ rules. It is showing you what you are being prepared for right now. Not survival, not merely being rescued from judgment, not just entry into a pleasant afterlife, authority, responsibility, a throne. The life you are living at this moment, the decisions you make, the faithfulness you maintain or abandon, the testimony you hold or slowly release, is the training ground for something that no millennium environment can produce on its own. The glorified saints who reign with Christ did not become equipped to govern during the millennium. They became equipped through everything they chose before the millennium arrived. Every act of faithfulness that cost something real, every moment they held the testimony when letting it go, would have been so much easier. Daniel chapter 7 verse 27. And the kingdom, and the dominion, and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. This is not a figure of speech for a pleasant spiritual state. This is a description of governance, the saints of the Most High. The covenant people of God across every era are given the kingdom, the dominion, the authority over the kingdoms of the earth. Daniel saw this 7 centuries before Christ in a vision of world history compressed into prophetic imagery. And the final chapter of that vision is not Rome conquering everyone, not any human empire maintaining control, not any ideology achieving its utopia. It is the saints governing everything under the King who made them capable of it. Revelation chapter 20 does not end at the millennium. The millennium, the binding of Satan, the first resurrection, the 1,000-year reign, the final rebellion, the white throne, is the penultimate chapter. Chapter 21 opens with something that surpasses the millennium, the way dawn surpasses the first light before it. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. The millennium is the last chapter of the old creation story, the final demonstration within the original created order. What follows is not the same story continued with improvements. What follows is an entirely new order of existence, in which the first heaven and the first earth, with all their history and all their capacity for rebellion and redemption, have passed away. Something genuinely unprecedented begins. Revelation chapter 21, verses 3 and 4. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. God dwelling with humanity, not at a distance, not through the mediation of priests and sacrifices, not in a temple the nations approach once a year, face to face, the thing the tabernacle in the wilderness pointed toward, that every temple only foreshadowed, that the incarnation previewed, that the millennium demonstrated from a still separated posture, finally, completely, permanently accomplished. God with his people. Every tear, including the ones you shed in this life, wiped away. What do you do with all of this? What is the right response to a vision of the future this large? The millennium, the white throne, the new heaven and the new earth, the dwelling of God with humanity face to face. The temptation is to receive it as information, significant, worth knowing, but ultimately a future event with limited relevance to today. That response would miss everything. The entire sequence is not a calendar designed to satisfy theological curiosity. It is a description of what you are being prepared for, and therefore a description of what matters right now. Every decision you are currently postponing, every testimony you are currently softening, every compromise you are currently rationalizing, each of those choices is shaping who you will be when the 1,000 years begin. The path to a throne runs through the choices you make before the throne becomes visible. The first resurrection does not reward impressive performance. It does not reward comprehensive theological knowledge or the most sophisticated understanding of end times timelines. Revelation 20 verse 4 describes those on the thrones in terms of two things: the testimony they held and the refusal to compromise with what stood against the king. These are not dramatic criteria visible only in arenas. Holding the testimony means continuing to speak truthfully about Jesus Christ and to live consistently with that testimony when the social, relational, and material cost of doing so is real. Refusing to compromise means making specific choices in specific moments, not to exchange the genuine for the convenient. These are choices available to every believer in every era, under every form of pressure. They are available to you today, in your situation, at your cost, with your testimony. Something in you that has been sitting quietly through this entire video needs to be said directly. Your life right now is not simply waiting for the future to begin. Your life right now is the future being shaped. The authority given to the saints in the millennium is not distributed based on a single moment of decision. It reflects a trajectory, a pattern over time of choosing the kingdom over the convenient, the testimony over the comfortable, the genuine transformation of the spirit over the appearance of transformation that impresses no one who sees clearly. Every choice you make today is a choice about who you are becoming. And who you are becoming is what you will be given to steward when the age to come arrives. The seeds you plant in faithfulness now are the authority you will carry then. The argument that God has been building through all of human history arrives at its conclusion in these 2 chapters of Revelation. Eden was not God's mistake. The law was not a failed experiment. The incarnation was not premature. The church is not God's backup plan. Every era, every covenant, every form of opportunity was intentional, all of it building toward the demonstration that takes its final form in the millennium. God does not simply assert that he was right, he shows it. In the most comprehensive demonstration in history, 1,000 years of optimal conditions, and still the unregenerate heart remains what it has always been. The argument closes, the evidence is complete, and every judgment that follows from it is just, because every reasonable alternative was genuinely offered first. The early Christians who read the book of Revelation were not reading prophecy about events in their distant future. They were reading a letter addressed to 7 specific churches in Asia Minor, written to people being threatened with exactly the choice Revelation asks about. Maintain the testimony or compromise to survive. The promise of thrones was not abstract to Polycarp or to Ignatius or to the thousands of believers who died in the decades after the letter was written. It was the reason, The why behind the willingness to stand in the arena and refuse. The why behind the prayer of gratitude for the fire. The why behind 86 years of service offered without regret. They were not simply enduring something they could not escape. They were choosing something they understood the value of. They knew that what they held in that moment was shaping what they would be given in the next. The 1,000 years are coming. The thrones are real. The first resurrection is real. The promise is not adjusted based on historical distance from its original recipients. It is as binding today as it was in Smyrna in 155 AD. As binding as the day John wrote it on Patmos. What changed is not the promise, What changed is the form of the pressure, the specific shape of the compromise being offered, the particular cost of holding the testimony in your city, your workplace, your family, your generation. Different cost, same choice, different arena, same throne. Choose now, bear witness now, hold now. Because the King who begins the 1,000 years is the same one you serve today. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I received this truth." I have placed another video on your screen right now, your next step on this journey. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.